Before we get to John Dewey, let me just round out what we were saying about American pragmatism generally and William James in particular. We were seeing some similarities between Whitehead's process philosophy and James's kind of pragmatism. We'll find more still in John Dewey. But similarities because of their rejection of Descartes and foundationalism, because of their concern for the primacy of concrete experience, rather than some artificial, abstract view of what experience is, such as you find in John Locke. The organic model where individual events are all interrelated into one whole process. Those things in common, I think, between pragmatism and Whitehead. The big difference between the two traditions is the methodological naturalism of the pragmatists, begun by Charles Sanders Peirce. You remember the handout and his conception of the fixation of belief. But pretty explicit as well in William, which is the notion of scientific method that Peirce had. So James is bringing that into philosophy. It means then that philosophy is going to be limited to what has significance for concrete experience, for what has practical consequences. And James had published a book under the title Radical Empiricism. Radical Empiricism. The point being that John Locke wasn't radical enough. And in radical empiricism, he operates, you see, with a pragmatic theory of meaning. The only meaningful disputes are those which have practical consequences. Pragmatic theory of meaning. And so he refuses to discuss any issue related to substratum or substance, mind, substance, matter, substance, so forth. It's unrelated to experience, makes no difference. Similarly, he refuses to get into debates over metaphysical monism versus metaphysical pluralism, materialism versus idealism. And you begin to wonder if the whole range of theoretical issues in philosophy is being abandoned. Well, it's this sort of thing, that radical empiricism theory of meaning, which I think underlay the comment I mentioned to you later, which restrict what is mentally significant, cognitively significant, to what has certain kinds of empirical consequences of a verifiable sort, you see. And here in James, it's radical pragmatism, and the positivists, it's what Ayer called the elimination of metaphysics. You'll read Ayer's chapter by that title when we get into positivism. So James then has that note. This tendency to look for empirical consequences, to verify by empirical consequences, comes out in an essay of his called The Will to Believe. The Will to Believe, which you're likely to read in Philosophy of Religion, for instance. What James is doing is responding to a piece by an earlier writer, W.K. Clifford, a piece called The Ethics of Belief, in which Clifford argued that if there is not a weight of evidence for one view rather than another, a weight of argument, then it's morally irresponsible to make a decision. You should withhold judgment. There's the old evidentialist line of John Locke, you see, you have to proportion your belief to the evidence. And if there is no greater degree of evidence for one than another that's significant, then serve that evidentialist demand, how are you going to decide? You see? And his point is that you ask yourself in terms of the consequences of the two beliefs for concrete experience, which for James, with his psychological background, means for your psychological well-being. So that if one belief promises more for you psychologically than the other, then that is sufficient grounds for exercising a will. The other is, I think, the thing coming out of the Scottish realist influence on contemporaries of ours like Alvin Plantinga, who says to the evidentialist demand, I don't see any reason to believe that. In other words, where's the evidence of the evidentialist demand? You think? Because he's trying to say there are certain beliefs which come so naturally, spontaneously, we really have no choice about withholding belief. So William James, in that piece, you see his method at work. He has another essay in which he talks of tough context of belief. Now, while that sounds as if it's pretty relativistic, you see, the fact is, if you're looking at the psychology of belief, the nature of the personality does affect it. You know, I wonder if Kant's massive critique, that some of you have fallen in love with, could ever have been written by California hippie. You see, that was the work of a Prussian bachelor whose life was so organized that the neighbors set their clocks by when he walked down the street to his university. And the laid-back California lifestyle would hardly produce that sort of work. Well, those of you who take the Kant seminar next year with my friend Stu Hackett will see similarities between his type of psychological makeup and the critique of pure reason. I mean, dear Stu, he's so organized, utterly, meticulously. When he went to India to study Hindu philosophy some years ago, he always had a nervous breakdown because they were so disorganized. And the relationship between psychology and personality is a fascinating thing. And of course, if you want to overcome that psychological dependency, obviously you need some more universal points of reference. You want to know what is generic human nature, you see, rather than what comes naturally for the generically human. Which I take it is the sort of thing that Augustine was doing when he says about the heart being restless until, you see, he thinks that's generically human. Well, we'll find similarities between that sort of thing and existentialism, some sorts of existentialism as well. The primacy of the practical, you see, involves human subjectivity, the whole person, our inwardness, as well as the consideration of objective factors. And in James particularly, that's evident. Maybe that's enough about James to illustrate what he's doing. Any comments, or are we ready for the big D? Dewey. Okay. Dewey sounds fairly recent when I say he was born in 1859 and died in 1952. I think he's the first one of whom we've come past mid-century, 1952. Dewey is representative not only of pragmatism, which is basically a method of dealing with philosophical and other questions, but he's also representative of what I like to call, much informed by Darwin's theory of natural selection. This evolutionary naturalism of his is a step from the evolutionary idealism in which he began philosophically. Evolutionary idealism, with the notion of historical process unfolding to more and more complex forms of life, physical, social, cultural, to more and more concrete experience. Now, in this evolutionary naturalism of his, you find these three key concepts, which I think will help you to see very quickly what he's doing in the various topics he tackles in his philosophical writings. And of course, he tackles pretty well all of these just in Reconstruction, the book you're reading. His concept of experience, first of all, is much closer to the concept you find in Whitehead and James than it is to the concept of experience in John Locke. So Whitehead, James, Dewey, they're three of a kind, to a certain extent. Experience includes affective experience, the psychological, emotional. Well, that was the case with Whitehead and James. But it also includes social and cultural experience. And as you read his book, you perhaps wonder to yourself if he isn't influenced by writers in the sociology of knowledge, because he's talking about all of the social and cultural influences in the shaping of philosophy. In fact, if Whitehead is talking about the influence of natural science on philosophy, Dewey is talking about the influence of social change on philosophy. You see? Whichever one you think of, notice how vastly different that is from Descartes' stove-heated room, in which there are no influences from outside. You see? The stove-heated room becomes symbolic of so much. The isolated individual in the privacy of his own mind, shutting out every external influence, historical or anything else. You see? It's a constant flowing process of which you are hardly conscious. It's so fluid. I remember at the time I first read Dewey and came across the notion of fluid experience, I had a 46 Dodge, which had what was then called fluid drive. What was fluid drive? Well, I'm not quite sure, but it was, I think, a step towards automatic transmission, because the change was so much smoother that you were hardly conscious of changing gear, though you still changed it manually. A fluid drive. You're hardly conscious of going from one moment or one situation to another. The one flows into the other. Fluid drive, fluid experience for Dewey. But fluid experience, which is really just a product of habit, habitual behaviors, habitual responses, is interrupted by what Dewey calls problem situations. Problem situation. And it's only problem situations which stir thought. You see, the role of intelligence, of intellect, is in the resolution of problem situations. Otherwise, you go along habitually without thinking. Do you think about what you're doing when you drive? Or do you just really think about what to do when you get into a problem situation? I remember driving in Seattle. And if you've ever driven in Seattle, you know there are some very steep hills with stop signs at the top. It's almost as bad as driving in some parts of San Francisco. You know, you've seen the pictures of the hill that goes round and round and round. You know, they have ones that go out straight with stop signs at the top. Now, how do you, normally behave that way if you grow up driving in flat pit country around here? Problem situation. You think of several alternatives and then do what I've done on such occasions from time to time, pull on the emergency brake and then push in the clutch and change gear. And gradually release the emergency brake, hoping that you apply enough gas to get it over the top. You know. Well, the point is that fluid experience is interrupted by problem situations which demand thought. You come up with ideas. I know what I'll do. Hey, let's try that. And so it's experimental thinking. You see? Experimenting with ideas in order to resolve problems. Now, if you love looking for dialectical situations, a problem situation is a dialectical situation. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. The thesis is the fluid experience that is interrupted by the antithesis in a problem situation, some threatening situation. Thesis, antithesis. And what you're looking for in coming up with the right idea is a synthesis, which will enable you to embrace the thesis of the antithesis and move on to the next. The synthesis becomes the thesis for the next. So the dialectic is right there. Well, intelligence, then, as problem solving in the course of habitual experience, which leads to his functionalist psychology. Functionalist psychology is, in simple terms, the theory that all of our mental processes, psychological processes, are simply functions of bodily need, functions of biological need. So our desires are biologically based functions of an organism that's trying to adjust to its environment, trying to meet desires in the light of what you find out about the problem situation. You don't need to worry, it's going to be all right, look at that. And growth is not a steady movement towards a fixed goal, but an ongoing evolutionary process, in which various experiences are being incorporated into the ongoing experience, which is the self. Functionalist psychology. And you can look at something of that in pages 83 or 86, for instance, pages 5 and 6 early on, where he insists that we are creatures of desire rather than of intellect, basically. Telos. There are no fixed ends to pursue in ethics or anything else. There are no fixed laws of thought. How we think is simply a tool for adjustment in a changing world, and the laws of thought have simply arisen as tools that have proved successful in that adjustment. So his point is then that philosophy is not pure theory. It arises in a practical context. It feeds back into a practical context. Concrete experience is its entire matrix, not theory for theory's sake. Well, those three concepts, I think, sum up what you can call, if you like, the theoretical core of Dewey's thinking. I have to be careful how you say theoretical with Dewey, but the theoretical core of his thinking. This is the grand hypothesis, which generates lesser hypotheses in regards to epistemology, philosophy of mind, etc., etc., for which he thinks there is experimental confirmation. Applications. All right, run through those. We can rather quickly. I already said that he talks